Hello and welcome to our Redeemer Lutheran Church Bible study of Psalms. This is Psalm 3 and 4. If you're looking for the worship link for this weekend, I will put that video link right up here and you can click on over to that. We are continuing our study of Psalms here, and today we're doing Psalm 3 and 4, which gets us into a very interesting section, particularly about David's life. And especially these first Psalms that David is writing, or at least ones that are put together first for us. Again, we don't know who exactly arranged all the Psalms, and they don't go in chronological order. But these first Psalms really give us a glimpse into the wide range of David's life and David's emotions. And he gives us a wonderful example of faith as he pours out his heart in these lyrics, really. David was a writer of poetry, and he was a musician. And so we see that in these Psalms, and there are definitely some clues that are dropped for us about how they were used, although we don't know for sure. So we are using the English Standard Version. However, you are free to use whatever translation you may have handy. I will try to put the text up on the screen. I'm trying to get better at moving that up as I go along, and you'll kind of have to deal with me squinting to read it, but it'll be on the screen and you can follow along that way as well. So let's transition into the text and see where that takes us. Okay. We actually want to be in Psalm 3, so there we are. We're going to start there and hopefully get to 4. Right off the bat here, what we see is that there is a little bit of a note. And this actually is in the Hebrew text. It's not something that was added later, where it says, a Psalm of David, when he fled from Absalom, his son. That gives us a lot of information, and it calls upon a lot of history that if you've read the scriptures, you might remember. However, it's not really one of the big stories that people are. It's not like Noah or even the crossing of the Red Sea or anything like that. However, there is one detail that most people who read it will remember forever, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But this psalm tells us who wrote it. As we said last time, many of the Psalms may or may not have had particular authors that are revealed to us. Many of them are from David, although we know Moses wrote one. Solomon certainly wrote some. Sons of Korah wrote others. And a lot of them are just anonymous. It's a text that's important rather than who wrote it. However, here in this third Psalm, we have David as our author. And we are given the further information that he wrote this when he fled from Absalom, his son. Now, it's a big deal for a king to flee to begin with, and then that the fact that it was from his own son that he was running away from is really kind of a remarkable notation. And so we can pretty much surmise that this was not a pleasant time in David's life. Anytime that you have to flee because your own son is coming after you is probably not a good day. And so David is certainly not in a happy place as he writes these words. And you see that there in the first line, "O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God." A little bit of history. And the story of David and his son Absalom are really one for the ages. So I'll just try to summarize it greatly. A lot of this can be found in 2 Samuel 12, 13, 14, and onward. But I'm going to kind of condense a lot of it for you today. So David, of course, had multiple children. He had multiple wives. Started off with being betrothed to the daughter of Saul, and when Saul gave her away to another suitor, David went out and married 2 random women, and that wasn't what God wanted for David. Again, God's intention he set up way back in Genesis 3, where he sets what marriage is between one Adam, one Eve, puts them together in one marriage. So David does something that is against God's design and against God's will, and yet God still worked through that sin to bring about everything that God needed to happen. And we see that theme over and over again in the scriptures, that while God doesn't set people up to sin, what he does is he uses their sin to bring about something good in the end. Again, that final goodness being, of course, Jesus Christ. And if you didn't have some of the terrible things that happen in the Old Testament, you would never come to the birth of Jesus as we have it in the New Testament. So God works through that sinfulness, works through those poor decisions, works through that calamity and tragedy to bring about his plan, always. And that gives us a lot of confidence in knowing that when we're facing with a decision, even if we do really royally mess it up, we can rest assured that God can work through that to bring about what he wants, not what we want. The difficult thing is what he wants may not be visible to us, may not even be visible to our generation. Ruth and Boaz is another story, one that I love. Without the tragedy of Ruth losing her husband and her family and having to move to Bethlehem, she would have never met Boaz. Without meeting Boaz, you wouldn't have David, you wouldn't have Solomon, and then you wouldn't have any of the descendants, and you wouldn't have Jesus, because they're of the family line. So even in that generation, nobody could look at that tragedy and say, oh, well, that obviously happened for the best. So what God has planned may not even be visible in your lifetime or in your children's lifetime. And so he can see things that we cannot. And just because we can look back and say, I don't see what God's purpose was in any of that, doesn't mean that there isn't one. And the scriptures really bear witness for that and really give us that insight that God has plans that stretch thousands of years, eternity in that respect. And so we rest assured in that way. So David eventually has some sons. The first is Amnon. Okay, he's a firstborn. Then there is one who we often refer to as Daniel. He had a different name, Chaldea or something like that. I forget what it was, Chaldani, something like that. But most of the time he just goes by Daniel. And then Absalom was his third born. However, something happened to the second son, and he is never really mentioned beyond just being listed as one of David's sons. And so most of us assume that he died at some point before any of the problems with Absalom arose, certainly before anybody was looking for a successor to King David. He's not even being considered. So Amnon is the heir to the throne. And then Absalom, although he's the third born son, is actually the second in line for the throne. Okay? Now, when we go to 2 Samuel 14, we have this interesting, terrible story about that. Well, back up. First, it's important to realize Absalom is, in many ways, David, his spitting image. 2 Samuel 14:25 actually says that there was nobody better looking in all the kingdom than Absalom, King David's son. And from head to toe, Samuel writes, there was not a blemish on his body. And so this was a prince, and he was a good-looking prince, and he was apparently a charmer, and he liked the pomp, and he had 50 men that ran before him to announce his coming wherever he went. And so this is somebody that liked the public eye, was at home there, really liked the attention, probably was very good with the ladies, okay, a lot the same way that David was. And so a lot of people probably looked at Absalom and said, this definitely is King David's son, a chip off the old block. And so that's kind of important as we see what Absalom will do in the coming years, okay? So now we got to go back a little bit. 2 Samuel, I think it's in 14. So Absalom had a sister who was named Tamar, and there were multiple Tamars in the Old Testament. So this is Absalom's sister Tamar. Okay, they shared both David as their father, and their mom, I think it's Maacah, was their mother. They had a half-brother, an older half-brother, Amnon, okay, the firstborn of David, and I don't remember if it was Abigail or I'd have to look that up, but it's a half-brother. So Amnon is a half-brother to Absalom and Tamar. Amnon had a thing for Tamar, and this was well known. He talked to people in the royal court about it, so much so that one of the advisors to King David helps him develop this nefarious plot. He tells him to pretend that he's sick, and then to ask his father David to send his sister, his half-sister, to come and take care of him, and particularly to make him some food and, wait on him hand and foot to bring her dear half-brother back to health. And David says, well, of course, sure, why not? Because he didn't know any of this. So Tamar goes to Amnon's house, and she takes care of him. And he keeps up the act, right? And even coaxes her into the bedroom to make the food in there because he's so ill. He just can't, come out of the bedroom. And there he rapes her. And she continually says, I'm your sister. This is wrong. This is not what God wants. It's not befitting of the royal family. And I'm your sister, man. And still it happens. And after that, Amnon, after the deed is done, hates her, it says. And he tries to put her out of the house. And she says, oh, no, you started this. You did this. So now we should get married. And that public scandal would be less than if you deprived me of my virginity, deprived me of ever having a husband, brought shame on our family, and then don't do the right thing. And Amnon actually calls the guards to come and put her out of the house. So obviously this gets around, particularly to Absalom. He's one of the first to find out. And Absalom is livid, rightly so. So then Absalom waits 2 years. He plots this revenge for 2 years. What David was doing about all of this, I don't know. I don't think it's there in the text, which tells us if he, rebuked Amnon for this or whatever. But it definitely seems like he's outside of the story at this time. Okay, so Absalom takes 2 years, and then he throws a feast, and he invites the king's family. King David's family, so his relatives, his brothers and sisters, his half-brothers, half-sisters, whatever, okay, invites them all, Amnon included. And there, at a certain time, Absalom gives the signal, and his men come in and they kill Amnon in revenge for raping Tamar. Word originally gets to David that all his sons were killed by Absalom, and David is thought that he just completely had his family decimated. And then very quickly he finds out that no, it was just Amnon, and the reason was because he did this thing to Tamar. David's still pretty upset because Amnon was the heir apparent, And it definitely would seem that if Daniel, the secondborn, is out of the picture at this time, that Absalom took advantage of the situation, even if he was rightfully angry, even if he was planning revenge just because of his sister, that he definitely took advantage of that situation. And now he gets rid of the guy between him and the throne. So David probably saw that, and so it wasn't as just cut and dried as David was upset that one of his sons killed the other. I'm sure that was part of it too. Absalom then flees, and I forget how long he's gone. I think it's for like 3 years. I think I'm looking at my notes here. Yes, so Absalom is in exile for 3 years after he kills Amnon. And then his father David welcomes him back with open arms. And David has a history of doing this, of being angry and then very quickly moving past that and trying to make amends, which I suppose is only right. So Absalom comes back into his father's house, but he doesn't really get with the program of being in his father's house and the heir apparent. Instead, Absalom begins a 4-year scheme to undermine his father David. In particular, he would kind of catch the people that were going to see the king to handle their problems, their lawsuits. And Absalom would treat them very well, would flatter them, and would say to them, oh, well, yeah, if my father had designated somebody to deal with these issues, you might actually get some results, but you're probably just going to go there and wait all day. Or you might not even get to see the king. You might get some random person that'll just tell you whatever. If it were up to me, this is what I would do. And he really, really tried to win the hearts of the people through flattery and through lying and through scheming. And Samuel tells us that it worked, that he really won the hearts of the people. So much so that Absalom is able to put together a sizable force. And he then lies to his father David. He says, oh, well, when I was in exile, I made this vow that I would go and worship God at Hebron. Let me go there. Of course, Hebron is an important city. It's kind of the center for spiritual life, even more so than Jerusalem in a lot of ways. But so Hebron was an important place. And David says, well, sure, yeah, fine, go. That's fine. So Absalom goes to Hebron, and there he declares himself to be king, which is kind of unique because, well, actually it's not unique because that's exactly where David was anointed king of Israel, was at Hebron. And so we're going to see now Absalom is going to do a lot of the things that David did in order to kind of point out that, hey, I should be king, and I have the bloodline, and you all love me, so just let me be king. So he starts that with Hebron. Absalom has a big enough force that David is really concerned, and so David gathers up who he can, and he flees Jerusalem. Before he does, though, he leaves 10 concubines in charge of the house to take care of the house and the property. Okay? And again, David shouldn't have had concubines. That wasn't part of God's plan. And yet he did. He did it. And he will bear the iniquity for that. Just the same way that he did with Bathsheba and everything else that he did. Okay? We're not condoning that practice. We're just saying that this happened. This is what David did. He left 10 concubines, his royal harem behind. Okay. Interestingly enough, when David leaves, he doesn't take the Ark of the Covenant with him, but the priests bring it. Once they figure out what's going on, the priests pack up the Ark of the Covenant and they carry it out to David, and they say, where you go, we will go, because you are the rightful king of Israel. David, again in his righteousness, actually orders them to take it back to the temple and the priests to go with it, because that's where it belongs. And David says, if I am the rightful king of Israel, and if I find favor in God's eyes through all of this, he will bring me back. And if he doesn't, then, well, then that's not God's will. Okay? But the Ark of the Covenant and the priests need to be in God's house. So take it back. So they do. Before David leaves Jerusalem completely, he does something interesting. He goes up to the Mount of Olives. And this is in 2 Samuel 15:30. It says that David walked up the Mount of Olives weeping to beseech God, to ask God's favor and his will and his protection and his deliverance. Again, this is one of the reasons why we talk about David being a typological prediction of Jesus Christ, meaning that aspects of David, his life, his personality, the things that he does, the things that God does for him, are really pointing ahead to Jesus, the king that is to come. Okay, so sometimes you'll hear that David was a type of Christ. Okay, it means a typological interpretation, that when we look at the aspects, the factors are the same, and they're similar in that way. So we just came through Easter season, of course, Holy Week. We know that Jesus goes up on the Mount of Olives. Okay, we have that. Of course, Jesus weeping in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? Asking that this cup be taken from him. Okay, so here we see a very similar thing happening for both David and for Jesus. Okay, so David goes up the Mount of Olives. When he comes down, interestingly enough, he is met by some of his servants who bring him, among other things, a donkey and bread and wine. Holy Week, Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey. That was the steed of David's royal family. That'll come to play if we talk about Absalom here in a little bit. But so that's particularly important. Bread and wine, Maundy, Thursday. The similarities are there. Again, God kind of saying like, hey, there's these things happening and they've happened before and they're kind of connected and they're going to tell you the same story. Okay. So we have David who's leaving the holy city of God. And he does so on a donkey, bread and wine, Mount of Olives, weeping. Okay. And you have Jesus who comes back, on a donkey, to have bread and wine, go to the cross, all of that. Okay. So where David left, Jesus comes back, and it is God's king, God's deliverer, coming back to his people and to the holy city of God. So there's definitely some bookends that are happening there. Okay, so that was 2 Samuel 15, 30, and 16, the first verses there, where you get that leaving Jerusalem. If you want to go and look that up, it's in 2 Samuel 15 and 16. Okay, so David leaves, right? He actually thinks that he's going to find some help from his loyal subjects. He comes up to the house of this old guy that he thinks, oh, this guy will help me. And instead, the guy comes out throwing rocks at David and cursing him, which was a blasphemable offense. You could be executed for that. You'd be stoned for that. But he's so much in the camp of Absalom, calls David a murderer and a slanderer. All these things. So David has to actually go outside of his own territory. He crosses the Jordan, and he is outside of his own territory with just his soldiers. Probably didn't have a whole lot of time to take anything. And Absalom instead is coming with a massive force into Jerusalem. Comes into Jerusalem, and he says, okay, well, my dad's already left, so what do we do? And one of his advisors, who was also an advisor to David, said, you know what you should do? You should sleep with his concubines. That would really show the people that you have taken over everything that your father was. So what do? They put up a tent on the top of the roof, and there in 2 Samuel 16:22, we are told that Absalom sleeps with David's concubines, quote, in the sight of all Israel, end quote. You could use your imagination for that, I suppose. And but what we see is something that this was not a godly act. It's just, if you thought your family was messed up, okay, you probably don't have much on King David. All right, because this is messed up. So David's family does this, and yet David is a type of Christ. That, again, Christ is not afraid to be numbered with sinners and to be born from a lineage of terrible and gross sinners. So don't ever feel that Jesus is too good to be hanging around with you, or that have compassion or care about you. Look what he put up with David and Absalom, okay? Interestingly enough, where is it that David sees Bathsheba? On the roof, okay? The adultery that happens there, and his son dies for that sin. He loses the child. That's part of the sin that comes to bear because of the adultery and then the murder of Bathsheba's husband, Uriah. Anyway, so Absalom does everything that he can to pretend that he is king and that he should be considered king. Okay. Absalom takes some more counsel and says, okay, we're going to go get David. So muster up the troops. Let's go out to meet him. We heard he's northeast somewhere across the Jordan, so we're going to ride out to meet him. David gets his soldiers ready, and they're going to engage them in the woods of Ephraim, probably about some, I don't know if it's 13 or 30 miles, but it's a little bit of ways northeast of Jerusalem. And there was some heavy wooded areas here, and that plays into the battle for some reason, probably because the forces got stuck in the underbrush, and David's men were already there and picked them off. I don't know, but it would have been knowledgeable to the people that lived in that area, because the note is in 2 Samuel. So David gets his troops together, but before he sends them out, he tells them, deal kindly with my son Absalom, meaning don't kill him, okay? So despite everything that was happening, David still has compassion and mercy on his son, the same way that he had when he was fleeing Saul. And you remember that he was in the cave and could have killed Saul. Instead, he cuts the hem of his garment and then shows it to him to show him that, hey, I could have killed you, but I had mercy. David says the same thing with Absalom. So they go out, they battle. David's forces win, and they win pretty easily, I guess. It was a terrible battle. 20,000 people died, and yet this was not a toss-up battle in the end. David's forces won particularly. And one of the reasons why they won was because Absalom was riding, and this is the story that most people remember, okay? So Absalom is riding, and he's on a donkey. Again, he's waiting, showing I'm like my father. And so David rode a donkey into Jerusalem. So I'm going to ride a donkey. Okay. And again, it's all pointing ahead to Christ. And while he's riding, he's not looking where he's going. And there's a low-hanging branch with a V. And he gets it caught right in the neck. It suspends him off the ground as the donkey keeps going. And so Absalom is there hanging in midair, right? Choking to death slowly. And he can't get down. So God unseats the usurper from the donkey because David was the rightful one, and because David was the forerunner of Christ, who would be seated on a donkey and brought into the kingly city. Okay, so anyway, while he's hanging there, one of David's generals has the opportunity to kill him. I don't remember which one that was. There were 3 of them. But he says that, listen, the king gave a command that we shouldn't harm him, but I didn't know what to do. He was up there in the midair. And one of the other generals, Joab, says, "What are you, nuts?" And Joab takes 3 spears, goes out and sticks them into Absalom's heart and kills him. And then the troops gather around to pierce him again to make sure that he's really, really dead. They throw his body into a pit out in the woods somewhere. They put some stones up. It's a monument, but really not a ceremonial funeral. This is put his body in there. The usurper, get rid of him. And they go back to David. They say, "Hey, everything's done. Your son is dead." And David mourns Absalom for a long time after that, despite everything. Okay? So, and then David comes back to Jerusalem, and the story goes on from there, which we're not going to get into because that was long enough, right? Okay, so that's David and Absalom. And so now, when we look back at this text, okay, and we see a Psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son, now we have this understanding of what he's actually... So David is on the run here, and we're going to kind of follow along. Okay? So, we start off, "O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God." They're saying God has forsaken him, and his son is going to take over. And if God was really with David, he would have prevented this. Okay? Then we see this strange thing over here. This word, Selah. We don't really know what that means. In Hebrew, it means to raise up or to exalt. Don't know if that was a command for the people singing this in church to stand up, or perhaps to raise their hands in some way. Perhaps it was for the music to rise, or maybe it was just an expression like amen or peace, shalom. We just don't know. And it's throughout the Psalms, and it's just kind of there as it kind of breaks up everything. So it's like this pause or this rest. So when you see that, don't think it's something that you should really know what it is, because we don't really know what it is, and apparently it's not important enough for God to really tell us what it meant. And so that's kind of why we think it was just a notation, perhaps to the people using it for worship. So there is no salvation for him in God. That's what people say too. Verse 3, "But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory, and the lifter of my head." So he's saying God will protect me. "I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill." Remember that last time that I will go up to Zion, okay, the holy hill of God, that hill that was right in front of Jerusalem. Symbolic of God's presence in God's temple. And so this is God's home. And God is going to answer. David has that confidence. Remember, he is fleeing for his life from his own son. And still he's saying, God has this all figured out. And that's why David is so incredible. Not because he was a particular example of moralistic fortitude, but rather he was a very faithful person, even in dark times. Doesn't mean he doesn't get angry. We'll talk about that maybe next session. We'll get into the imprecatory psalms and things like that. But he's faithful. "I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me." Again, just to sleep in those days was a risky endeavor. How many people died in their sleep, were overtaken by bandits, robbers, wild animals, who knows what. And even that's when you don't have somebody seeking your life. And so I lie down and sleep. For you, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. We'll see that in the next psalm. But this is the theme that comes there, that God watches over us while we sleep. I think it was Martin Luther who said it's probably one of the safest times in your life, because when you're sleeping, you can't really be sinning. And so God is going to watch over you during those blissful 8 hours. He doesn't have to work so hard to keep you on the straight and narrow. I think I'm paraphrasing very liberally there. I could be really wrong about that, but I think I read that sometime. So David is saying, "I will lay down and sleep, even when someone is seeking my life, and the Lord will watch over me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. And this is not hyperbole for David. This is truth. This is reality. That's exactly what he was facing. He had to flee his own land. He's now outside of his territory. He was safer outside of his kingdom than within it. I mean, it's remarkable. This is not hyperbole. This actually was the truth. There were 10,000s of people that were after him. So then he prays, verse 7, "Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek, you break the teeth of the wicked." Interestingly enough, that word for teeth there is the same one that's used in the lex talionis, the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Here we see David calling out that justifiable punishment for what has taken from him. Kind of interesting that David was the one that stole Bathsheba and on a rooftop, and now his own son does the same to him. So there's a little bit of what do you call that? Oh, I can't. The word is escaping me there, but you know what I'm saying. I hope that irony, not irony. Whatever. It's kind of late here. But you understand that David did it. Now it's happening to David. How about that? I don't know this personally, but I have been told by some people that do ultimate fighting, or whatever you want to call it, that to actually have your tooth knocked out from a strike is fairly rare, unless your tooth is already damaged or you've had some dental work or something along those lines, that you have to hit somebody just right and pretty hard in order to actually break their teeth loose. And if anybody can do that, I suppose it's God. And that's the kind of attack and retribution that David is calling God to come and deliver. And he says it in such a way that David is saying, God does it. He's doing it even now. Which is, again, a remarkable thing to have to say, to have that faith in God, even while you're running from your enemies, to say, God's got all this taken care of, and he will deliver me. And again, this is what we see in a lot of David's Psalms. He starts off with either anger or doubt or worry, depression, sadness, but in the end, it always ends here. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people. So he's saying, God will deliver, God will do, God's will be done, not my own. Again, we see things in David that we will also see in Jesus. And there's only 3 selahs in there, and we just don't know what they mean. And but they definitely seem to break up, one at the beginning, one in the middle, and one at the end. But we'll see that again in the next one. So that's David writing when he's fleeing from Absalom, and we're going to go to the next one. Psalm 4. May not have been written anywhere near Psalm 3 in terms of time. Psalm 3 was obviously written near the end of David's reign, because we know when Absalom's rebellion happened within David's lifetime. Psalm 4 isn't tied that way, and yet they do seem to kind of go together. And so whoever put these together, again, many think it might have been Ezra, did a nice job. And we might even assume that not just the words, but also the organization was directed by the Holy Spirit in that way. And but it's important to remember that the Psalms are not chronological in order. Okay? So Psalm 4, Answer Me When I Call, is just a title that we've appended to it. But the Hebrew does say, To the choir master with stringed instruments, a psalm of David. So once again, we know who wrote it. But here we have definitive instruction for worship, that the choir master, the person who's in charge of the music and singing, is to accompany this particular psalm with stringed instruments. And we'll see this happen as we go on. What those stringed instruments were, we're not completely sure. We know what was in use during those times in other places, but it could have been anything. But here we have not only the words, but also the music. And so this, again, is the hymn book for God's people, and it was used and is used that way to this day. So God says, answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. David writing this again. It certainly seems like he could have written this one right after Psalm 3, even though he may not have. You have given me relief when I was in distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. O men, how long shall my honor be turned into shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies? Again, very much could have been written during the time of his problem with Absalom, or a number of other times in David's life. But you can see his frustration that he's being slandered, and what he does right is perceived as wrong, and that people are loving lies rather than the truth. This is something that everybody sees in their life. Why doesn't the truth prevail when it's the truth? That hasn't changed in a long time, and it's not likely to change until the Lord comes again. That the truth doesn't always prevail. Good doesn't always win out. Not everything has a happy ending. Not everybody gets what they should. Bad things happen to good people. Good things happen to terrible people. And a lot of times it seems like the terrible people get by a lot better than those who are trying to do what is right. And that's because this world is upside down. We know that. God says that the prince of the world, the devil, hates everything that God has made. And so this world is backwards. And that's why God continually tells us to fix our eyes above rather than on things below, and that when he comes again, we will see things clearly. And those who have been laughed at by the world for pursuing righteousness and godliness and all those things God's pointing to will be finally vindicated. But that's, again, probably not in our lifetime. Could be, but probably not. And so we should expect that. And Jesus actually says, rejoice and be glad, because that shows that you are truly one of my disciples. That the world hates you because you belong to me. So the mark of suffering is one of the marks of the true church, that the church will always be persecuted. And personally, if something's popular, it generally sends up a red flag to me. And so often it's right. And I think the same thing can apply to churches, that your largest mega churches out there are probably not going to be the places where God's word is taught in its fullness, in its truth, and in its purity. I'll just leave it at that. You have a absolute plethora of choices of what to watch out there while you're quarantining at home, okay? And some of them are better than others, and some of them are absolute worst things that you could watch, because God tells us that in those last days there will be many that come in my name. That there will be false teachers that scratch the itching ears and tell people what they want to hear rather than the truth. And that's definitely happening in these days. And it's out there because the devil knows it's easier to get you to worship a fake Jesus than it is to get you to worship a devil with red horns and pitchfork, right? Doesn't have to get you to worship him. He just has to get you to lose sight of Christ, the real Christ, as he's revealed in the scriptures. So be careful. Your spiritual self is just as important as your physical self, your physical health, okay? And if you subsist on a diet of Snickers bars and Reese's peanut butter cups, your body is not going to be healthy. It might taste good, it might feel good for a time, but it's going to be unhealthy for you. And you can do the same thing with your spiritual health. You can fill it with junk food, spiritual junk food, and never get the meat of real theology and faithful biblical witness. And it'll be hurtful in the end. That's why Jesus says there will be many on the last day that say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not do this in your name? And he will say, I tell you the truth, I never knew you. We wonder how that can happen, but it's happening in our midst all the time. Okay? Just because you use the name Jesus doesn't mean that we're talking about the same person. Jesus is defined by what he does, and what he does is revealed in the Holy Scriptures. And so if your Jesus is not lining up with the full, truthful witness of the Holy Scriptures, it's not a real Jesus. It's a false Christ who are even now in the world, Revelation tells us. Okay? So anyway, people love vain words, seek after lies. Oh, man, that's the world right now. And again, that word Selah comes up again. Like, oh, Selah. But know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself. Sanctified is that word. Set apart means sanctified, the godly for himself. And the Lord hears when I call to him. Be angry and do not sin. I think the Hebrew here means tremble. See footnote. I wonder what the footnote says. Let's click that, see where it takes us. Be agitated. Whoa. There we are. Be angry. I want to say that the Hebrew there means more along the lines of be trembling. Not necessarily afraid, but unsettled. And yet, even when you have righteous anger, because there is such a thing as righteous anger, when you see something that is utterly wrong, that is blasphemous or unjust or whatever, it is okay to be angry. Jesus was angry when he walked into the temple and they were abusing God's house. He said, you've turned my house from a house of prayer into a den of robbers. Okay? He was angry, a righteous anger. That is not equivalent to sin. Okay? It can very easily lead to sin. Okay? Jesus' violence that he displays when cleansing the temple is still not sin. It was a righteous anger. Where that line is, that's difficult to suss out, but it is there. So when I move past being upset that somebody has wronged me and start plotting how I'm going to get back, then I've crossed that line. When I'm angry at somebody and then instead of forgiving that, I treat them. I want them to feel it in how I treat them, that they've really done me wrong. I want to hold it over their head. I want to use it to my advantage down the road. Again, we've crossed that line. So God says, be careful. And it's okay to be angry, but do not sin. Instead, ponder in your own hearts and on your beds and be silent. So, take a break, take a breath, sleep on it, think about it, and then come back. At the same time, offer right sacrifices and put your trust in the Lord. Let him sort things out. Let him seek vengeance. Let him judge and apportion to each according to their deeds. That's not your job. And so we can go both ways. Sometimes we want to judge people because it makes us feel better, or we think we have a right to, and it's really not our place. And everybody can universally say, oh, that's bad. Judge not, lest ye too be judged, right? That's what people like to throw in your face. However, there are many places where the Bible tells us to judge, that we are supposed to judge, okay? That we are supposed to judge between what is good and what is not good, what is godly and what is wrong. Some of us have vocations where we are to judge others. We have to. We're supposed to. We are given that authority and that responsibility. Pastors are one of them. Government is another. that they are given that place, and so they are called to judge between what is right and wrong. All right. Fathers in the household are given that responsibility and the authority as well, and God holds them accountable for that. So that whole thing of we can say, oh yeah, it's bad to judge, and then we can also say, oh well, that's definitely wrong, but who am I to judge? You're a Christian. God's word is clear. So we have to be careful of going one extreme to the other. So offer right sacrifices, put your trust in the Lord. If you are called to judge, then judge. If it is something that God speaks about, then you know what God has said. But in the end, in other things, just leave it up to God. There are many who say, who will show us some good? Okay, we see that mirrored from the psalm before. Lift up the light of your face upon us, O Lord. Again, face is a way of expressing God's favor, of God's attention, God's gracious provision, all the promises of God, seeing God face to face, very intimate way of knowing God. And here we see, lift up the light of your face, lift up your countenance upon us and give us peace. Okay, benediction. All right, you got that, right? So we're asking God to say, hey, there are many who see us pitiful Christians struggling along. How long, Lord, are you going to let this go? Give us something so that they'll know that we still are your chosen people. And we sometimes have to pray that to God. And not because he forgets, but because we forget. And we'll see that in the imprecatory Psalms when we get there, of commanding God to remember his promises. And again, David's style here, where even lamenting these terrible things about the world that seeks after lies and are slandering him, and he still comes back on a godly, faithful note. You have put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine abound. Interesting stuff here. Grain and wine, okay, the harvest, okay, two very common things, but for us, how do we get past bread and wine of communion? I'm not saying that David was writing about Holy Communion here, but the Holy Spirit, who's inspiring to David write, certainly knows that Holy Communion is coming, and that people are going to read both Old Testaments and New, and that we're going to make these connections. And I think that's the joy in my heart, that when grain and wine abound, okay? So God gives me more joy than people at the harvest, and God's food is better than the food of the field. All that can be bound up and seen there. But David's first and foremost thing is to just saying that God is the source of all joy. Okay? And all those people that think they have such great wealth and power and everything else, no, the real joy is found in knowing the Lord. And here, this verse, actually, it's right upstairs. We have it posted above Judah's bedroom door. In peace I will both lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. He just wanted that to be something that he remembers every night before he goes to bed. Well, of course, when he's a little bit older and can read. But we like that verse, and it's a good verse to remember, especially when you're afraid, when you don't know what tomorrow will bring, when you don't know what the night will bring. Again, we don't know that David wrote this while he was fleeing Absalom, but it very well could have been that he could have wrote this while he was fleeing Saul, for all we know. That he didn't know if he was going to survive the night, or if some assassin would creep up and get him. But he says, in peace I will both lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. What a wonderful place to leave it there. As we think about all the things that are going on in our world, and all of the fears that we have, all of the things that we're wondering and we don't know what tomorrow will bring. We don't care about loved ones. We wonder what will happen to them. We care about what might happen to us if we have the virus and we just don't know it yet, or if we're going to get it, or if there's something else out there that we don't know about that's being spread around, and we're going to find out about it 5 years from now, or if we get hit by a meteor tomorrow, or whatever it happens to be. Our life is constantly at risk, whether we know it or not. And that's why God's provision to say that I abide with you always, even to the end of the age, is so comforting. That no matter what comes today, tomorrow, tonight, that we'll be okay. God has us. In this life or the next, God has us. And in peace, I will sleep. And if I sleep in the dust of the earth, the death, then I will awaken to life everlasting once again. No matter what, God has you. And that's the confidence that we have. And every night that we go to bed, not knowing if we'll make it through the night, God still has us. And we can sleep and rest in peace, either for 6 to 8 hours, if you're lucky, or until whenever he comes again in glory. Doesn't matter. It's the same. And that's why the Bible talks about death, is sleep. Because we're going to wake up from that. And it's just a temporary condition. And in fact, it's a rejuvenating condition. For me to go from this life of pain and suffering and slander and upside downness to a life where I see God face to face and everything is set right, there's joy in that. A joy that the world out there doesn't understand. Like, oh, you're suicidal. No. Christians are not suicidal. They love this life, and they're thankful for every day that God gives them. But they are understanding that there is a better life, more life, that awaits them. And that's where the real life is, not this. This is the waiting room, okay? And then we go to the real party. So anyway, next time we'll tackle a couple more Psalms. We're still under quarantine. Again, the Bible studies will continue like this until we can be in person, and then I don't know what we'll do. Worship is still being broadcast. Again, that video at the very beginning, I'll put a link up at the top. And God bless you, and take care, and we will see you next week. Bye-bye.